Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of the darkest, most disgusting corners of medieval life, dentistry. Or rather, the horrifying excuse for dentistry people endured before anaesthesia, sterile tools, or even the basic concept of don't let your barber hack your gums open. Forget your modern dentist with clean gloves, soft lighting, and gentle drilling. Medieval dentistry was part torture chamber, part carnival sideshow, and all pain. Before we begin, do me a favour. Hit like and subscribe if you enjoy these kinds of journeys into history's strangest and her dirtiest secrets. And in the comments, tell me where you're tuning in from and what time it is. It always blows my mind knowing someone's falling asleep in New York while another person is listening from Berlin or Manila. Alright, get comfortable, pull that blanket tight, dim the lights if you dare, because tonight we're not stepping into a doctor's office. We're stepping into a medieval street where the man yanking your tooth is also the guy who just shaved your neighbour's beard, bled a patient with leeches, and maybe slaughtered a pig that morning. So, congratulations. You just woke up in the 14th century in a bustling town square. The stench of rotting meat, horse dung, and unwashed bodies fills the air. Your jaw aches with a tooth abscess so swollen your face looks half paralysed. The pain's unbearable, stabbing, throbbing, relentless. You need help, but your options? A barber surgeon with rusty iron pliers, or a travelling tooth drawer who'll yank it out in public while a crowd gathers to laugh at your screams. This was dentistry in the Middle Ages. Spectacle, agony, and often fatal. Let's talk about the tools first. Forget shiny steel instruments. Medieval dentists used blacksmith tongs, crude forceps, and devices ominously nicknamed the dental key. Imagine a metal hook shoved into your mouth, twisted around your rotten tooth, then wrenched sideways until the bone cracked. Sometimes the whole jaw broke, sometimes the wrong tooth came out, and sometimes they just kept pulling until your gums tore wide open. And anaesthesia? That was ale, wine, or if you were lucky, a handful of opium or mandrake root. Most of the time, you were fully awake. Your screams blended with the sound of street musicians and hawkers shouting about cabbages. In fact, tooth drawing was often performed as public entertainment. People actually gathered in marketplaces to watch, laugh and cheer, while some poor soul's molar was ripped out, blood spraying down their chin. It gets worse. Infected teeth weren't just painful, they were deadly. An untreated abscess could spread bacteria through your bloodstream, causing sepsis. People died from toothaches, but many also died from treatments. Pliers slipped, gums shredded, infections worsened. And because tools were never clean, diseases passed from one screaming mouth to the next. Now imagine you, sitting on a crude wooden stool in the centre of a market. The barber surgeon holds you down, while two men grip your arms. A pair of iron tongs disappears into your mouth. The pain is immediate, white hot, like fire shooting into your skull. The crowd jeers. A child laughs, and when it's done, if you're still conscious, the barber might wave your bloody tooth in the air like a prize before tossing it into the mud. Welcome to medieval dentistry. Torture disguised as healing. And that's just the beginning. Because what came next? Fillings made from beeswax, cauterizing gums with red-hot irons, and drilling holes into teeth with bow drills originally designed for wood, makes the torture chair look almost merciful. If you think a pair of modern pliers at the dentist looks intimidating, wait until you meet the medieval toolkit. Dentistry back then wasn't about precision, it was about brute force. And the instruments used were as crude and terrifying as the hands that held them. The most infamous? The dental key. Imagine a thick iron shaft with a curved hook at the end. shaped kind of like the key to a fortress door. The barber surgeon shoved this hook into your mouth, jammed it around the infected tooth, and then twisted hard. The idea was to lever the tooth out of the socket, like prying a nail from wood. In reality, the tooth often shattered, fragments of enamel ripped gums apart, roots stayed behind, festering. Jaws cracked under the force, but hey, the tooth was out, at least part of it. Then there were the tooth drawers tongs. These weren't delicate dental pliers. They were basically blacksmith's tools repurposed for human mouths. Long, jagged and rusting, they pinched the tooth in a death grip. If the grip slipped, the tongs crushed instead of pulled, turning a bad tooth into splinters, embedded deep in your gum. That's when the screaming really began. Imagine the sound: iron scraping enamel, bone cracking, the shriek of a person whose nerve endings are lit up like fire, and all of it without anaesthetic. And if the tooth wouldn't budge, out came the chisel and mallet. Yes, medieval dentists sometimes hammered teeth out of skulls. A wedge of iron against the tooth, a swing of the mallet, and crack. If you were lucky, the tooth dislodged. If not, your jaw fractured. This wasn't precision work, it was demolition. For infections of the gums, the methods were even more grotesque. Surgeons often believed rot came from bad humours trapped in the mouth. The solution? Cauterization. A red-hot iron pressed directly against your gum line. The searing heat burned flesh, sealed open wounds, and filled the air with the stench of cooked meat. Some patients fainted instantly. Others thrashed while being pinned down. And if you survived, you left with half your mouth charred black and maybe still infected. And don't forget the bow drill. Originally designed for carpentry, some surgeons adapted it for teeth. Picture a wooden spindle with a sharp point, spun rapidly by a string and bow mechanism. Drill a hole into wood. Perfect. Drill a hole into a molar. That was the idea. They'd bore into rotten teeth to release pressure. Sometimes they packed the hole with herbs, resin or beeswax. Sometimes they left it open, a festering cavity filled with food, pus and agony. But here's where things get even dirtier. Nothing was sterile. Tools were reused again and again without cleaning. The same tongs that pulled one villager's abscessed molar in the morning might yank another's by afternoon, carrying infections from mouth to mouth. Blood, pus, saliva, all smeared on iron and never washed off. Diseases like syphilis, septicemia, and even the plague could easily spread this way. It wasn't just about tools, though. It was about showmanship. Many tooth drawers worked in markets, performing extractions in front of cheering crowds. They carried their tools in leather rolls, displaying them like trophies. The bigger and scarier the tool, the more confidence villagers seemed to have in their skills. Watching someone get a tooth yanked wasn't just medicine, it was entertainment. Screams were part of the spectacle, and for the unlucky, if the tooth shattered and fragments stayed lodged, the solution was brutal digging. A surgeon would scrape the gum raw with hooks and knives, sometimes carving so deep they exposed bone. Infection was almost guaranteed. Some patients died days later, not from the toothache, but from the cure. Now imagine it's you, sitting on a wooden stool in a muddy street. The barber clamps your head between his knees. A massive iron key pushes against your molar. You smell his sweat, his unwashed hands. He twists. Your tooth cracks in half. The crowd gasps, some laughing, others wincing. He doesn't stop. He jams the hook deeper, twisting harder until something rips. You taste blood flooding your tongue, metallic and hot. He yanks again. And when the tooth finally comes free, he waves it triumphantly to the crowd. Your pain turned into theatre. This was medieval dentistry, Not science, not healing, but torture disguised as medicine. And the worst part, people lined up for it because the alternative was to let the pain and infection kill you slowly. And we're just getting started, because in the next part we'll look at what passed for medieval anaesthesia, a mixture of booze, herbs and prayers that barely dulled the agony but made the torture last longer. So let's talk anaesthesia, or rather, the miserable lack of it. Because medieval dentistry was less about numbing pain and more about distracting you long enough for the barber surgeon to get the job done before you passed out. Forget Novocaine injections, forget sterile syringes, forget reclining in a padded chair. In medieval Europe, the preparation for tooth extraction usually meant a mug of ale, a splash of wine, or if you were lucky, a jug of mead strong enough to knock a horse sideways. Patients were told to drink until they felt light. But here's the problem. Alcohol numbed the senses, sure, but it also thinned your blood, which meant more bleeding, faster, and sometimes uncontrollable hemorrhaging right there in the market square. Herbal remedies came next. Surgeons stuffed your mouth with mashed cloves, henbane, mandrake, or even ground up opium poppies if they had access. Cloves offered mild relief. Their oil is still used in dental care today. But the rest, they were poison as much as painkiller. Mandrake root was famous for its hallucinogenic properties. Too little, and it barely worked. Too much, and you collapsed, vomiting foam while your heart stuttered. Records tell of patients who slept through a tooth extraction and never woke up again. One popular concoction was called a dwale, a witch's brew of hemlock, lettuce juice, gall from a boar, and bile mixed with wine. Surgeons swore by it. Victims swore in agony when it failed. The line between anaesthesia and poison was razor thin, and in the dim light of a market or workshop, nobody was measuring doses carefully. And here's the grotesque twist. Some so-called pain cures were worse than the pain itself. A common remedy for toothache was to cauterize the nerve, not with heat, but with acid. Alchemists supplied dentists with sulfuric or nitric acid, which was dripped directly into the cavity. Imagine the burn, the hiss, the taste of chemical fire spreading through your mouth. Many patients screamed louder after the treatment than before. And the infection? It usually spread deeper. Others believed toothache came from tiny worms burrowing in the teeth, a myth that lasted well into the Renaissance. To cure this, barbers poured boiling oil, vinegar, or even urine into the mouth to smoke the worms out. The stench was unbearable, and yes, people did scream themselves unconscious from the sensation. No worms were ever expelled, just tissue cooked raw. Sometimes prayer was the only anaesthesia offered. Patients were told to bite down on a crucifix while a priest murmured blessings. Faith was supposed to dull the pain. In reality, it just gave you something to clench while the iron key tore your jaw apart. And of course, alcohol wasn't just for the patient. Surgeons themselves were often half drunk when they performed extractions. Imagine a barber, tipsy on ale, swaying slightly as he jams tongs into your mouth. His hands shake. He laughs with the crowd. He yanks too hard, pulling not just your bad tooth, but the healthy one next to it. Medieval dentistry wasn't just torture, it was sloppy torture. Now picture the scene. You're seated on a crude stool in a smoky tavern because the barber does side jobs after shaving patrons. He hands you a horn of mead. You gulp it down, trying to drown the agony in your jaw. The room spins. Someone stuffs a wad of herbs between your lips. It tastes bitter, acrid, wrong. The barber leans in with tongs. He mutters, "Hold still." You grip the table as he twists. Pain floods every nerve. The alcohol dulls nothing. You vomit mid-procedure. The crowd laughs as blood and bile spill down your chest. That's how anesthesia worked. And if you thought surviving was relief, think again. Because once the tooth was gone, the wound gaped open, raw and bleeding. Without antiseptic, infection crawled in almost instantly. Flies buzzed around the fresh blood. Surgeons stuffed the socket with rags soaked in vinegar, resin, or, disturbingly, dried cow dung, believed to draw out bad spirits. In reality, it introduced more bacteria. The smell of rot lingered for days. Some patients gagged every time they tried to eat. Others developed fevers that ended in death. But as brutal as this was, people lined up for it, because untreated dental pain was worse. And medieval society didn't view this as cruelty. They saw it as bravery. To sit in a stool, to endure the screams, to leave with bloodied jaws but no tooth. This was considered a victory. Crowds applauded. Surgeons basked in the spectacle. Pain wasn't just tolerated, it was celebrated. So the next time you sip from that little plastic cup of fluoride at your dentist's office, remember, in the Middle Ages, your fluoride rinse was a jug of ale, a pinch of poison, and a prayer you didn't choke before the tooth came free. If you thought the torture ended once the tooth was out, you'd be dead wrong. Because in medieval dentistry, the extraction was just the beginning of your nightmare. The real danger came afterward, when infection set in, creeping, spreading, rotting you from the inside out. Medieval people didn't understand bacteria. They didn't know that blood carries infection, or that a dirty iron tongue could pass disease from one screaming patient to the next. To them, a swollen jaw or a festering wound was a curse of bad humours or punishment from God, which meant the treatments they offered only made things worse. After a tooth was ripped free, the socket gaped open like a wound in battle. Blood pooled, sometimes spraying when an artery was nicked. Flies hovered instantly. In marketplaces, the tooth drawer might simply spit on the wound and stuff a rag inside to stop the flow. That rag, reused dozens of times, stiff with dried blood from strangers. Infection was guaranteed. Abscesses, pockets of pus buried deep in the gums, were a death sentence. Medieval surgeons tried to lance them open with knives. Picture it. Your jaw already swollen, throbbing, and tender. A barber presses a crude blade against it and slices. Pus gushes out, hot and foul-smelling, splattering down your chin. The crowd recoils. The barber wipes his knife on his apron and grins like he's cured you. But the infection? It's often spread deeper, slipping into the bloodstream. Many who endured cures like this were dead within days from septicemia. Gangrene of the mouth was another horror. With no antiseptic, rotting gums blackened quickly. Flesh sloughed off. The smell was indescribable, a mix of rotten meat, sour milk, and death itself. Neighbours sometimes refused to sit near sufferers in church because the stench was overwhelming. Imagine being ostracised not only for your screams, but for the stink of your decaying mouth. And then there was lockjaw. If tetanus spores entered through the raw gum wound, your jaw clenched shut, your body convulsed, and you died choking, muscles frozen like stone. Families often believed demons had seized their loved ones, never realising it was the barber's filthy tool that killed them. But it wasn't just infections from tools. Many died from post-extraction bleeding. With no way to cauterize properly, some patients bled endlessly, soaking through rags and collapsing from blood loss. A tooth drawer might try to stop it by pressing burning coals against the wound, searing flesh shut in a hiss of smoke. The pain was unimaginable. Some fainted on the spot. Some never woke, For those who survived, eating became torture. Every bite sent fire through raw gums, bread scraped against swollen tissue, meat rotted between open wounds. Without toothbrushes, food lodged in the gaps, feeding infection daily. And there was no escape. You lived with the taste of blood, pus, and decay in your mouth. And then came the superstitions. Some believed stuffing the socket with dried frog, mouse guts, or even dung could draw out the poison. Others dripped honey or wine into the wound, hoping sweetness would heal. More often, it just bred more bacteria. Desperate patients sometimes pressed dead men's teeth into the wound as charms, believing they absorbed pain. What they actually absorbed was more disease. Picture it. You've just survived a brutal extraction. Your mouth is swollen, your jaw barely moves. 3 days later, the pain is back, sharper, spreading. Your face balloons, one eye swollen shut. Pus leaks from your gum, tasting metallic and sour. You can't eat. You can barely breathe. At night you sweat and shiver with fever. Neighbours whisper, "You're cursed." The barber shrugs, saying, "It's in God's hands now." A week later, your body's lowered into the ground, killed not by the toothache itself, but by the cure. This was the hidden cost of medieval dentistry. Death was common, suffering was guaranteed, and survival was often a matter of luck, not skill. And yet people kept going back, because the pain of a rotten tooth, relentless, stabbing, consuming your every waking hour, was sometimes worse than risking death. A gamble, live with agony, or face the torture chair. Many chose the latter, knowing full well it might be their last day alive. When pain was unbearable, but fear of the barber's iron tongs kept you away from the stool, medieval people turned to something far stranger, magic. Because if science failed, and it usually did, superstition was the only hope left. And some of the cures for toothache were so bizarre and disgusting, it's a miracle anyone thought they worked at all. Let's start with the most common belief, toothworms. For centuries, people thought cavities were caused by tiny worms gnawing inside the tooth. If you felt throbbing pain, that was the worm moving. If you felt sharp stabs, that was the worm biting. Sounds ridiculous now, but medieval manuscripts are full of remedies to smoke out or kill these worms. One method was to heat henbane seeds over a fire and blow the smoke into the patient's mouth through a funnel. The idea, the worms would crawl out in disgust. What actually happened? The smoke scorched the gums, made patients gag and vomit, and sometimes even caused them to pass out. No worms ever appeared, but if you coughed hard enough, you might spit out blood and believe the cure had worked. Another cure? Boiling urine? Yes, you heard that right. Patients were told to gargle their own urine, or better yet, the urine of a child, because innocence was thought to draw out the pain. Picture yourself crouching over a bowl of steaming piss, holding it to your lips, while your neighbours look on, convinced the worms will flee your gums. The only thing that fled was your dignity. Then there were amulets. Medieval dentists, if you can even call them that, often handed out charms to ward off pain. Some were made from carved stones inscribed with prayers. Others used animal parts. A frog's leg tied to your neck, a wolf's tooth hanging on a string, or, most grotesquely, a dead man's tooth worn like jewellery. People genuinely believed carrying someone else's tooth would stop yours from hurting. The irony? Sometimes these teeth carried disease, passed from corpses into living mouths. Prayers and spells were another staple. A priest might recite incantations while holding a patient's jaw, asking saints to banish the toothworm. Some remedies combined faith with filth. One text suggests reciting the Lord's Prayer 3 times while rubbing donkey dung on the gum. Another recommended pressing a live eel against your cheek while chanting psalms. Medieval medicine wasn't about hygiene, it was about hope. And then there were outright humiliations. One widely recorded cure involved tying a live toad to your face. Yes, seriously. The toad's damp body was believed to absorb the swelling in your jaw. Villagers walked around with frogs or toads strapped to their cheeks, stinking, croaking, struggling, while their neighbours laughed or whispered that the magic was working. Imagine trying to sleep with a squirming amphibian against your face, slime soaking into your pillow, all because you thought it would end your agony. For the wealthy, the remedies got fancier but no less absurd. Ground up emerald mixed with vinegar was smeared onto teeth. Gold filings were placed in cavities as charms, not treatments. Even powdered mummy, yes, actual ground-up corpses, bought from tomb robbers, was prescribed for tooth pain. The logic was that the power of the dead could strengthen the living. What it really did was poison patients with rotting flesh and dust, and sometimes superstition and brutality merged. Some cures suggested driving a nail into a tree while reciting your name, and the pain would transfer into the wood. Others swore you could trap the toothworm by whispering spells into a dog's ear, then striking the dog on the head. The pain was passed into the animal. The poor dog got the blow, and the patient still screamed through the night. Now imagine yourself again, living in a muddy village with no real options. Your toothache flares, unbearable. You don't dare face the barber's tongs, so you let your neighbour tie a squirming toad to your cheek. Children point and laugh. The pain doesn't go away. Days later, the swelling worsens. You stink of slime, pus and shame. And still, the worm in your imagination keeps chewing. This was the madness of medieval medicine. When science couldn't explain pain, magic filled the void. People were desperate, and desperation makes you believe anything, even that a frog, a corpse's tooth, or a mouthful of piss might save you. The truth? None of it worked. The worms were never real. The amulets never healed. And most people eventually ended up where they feared most, back in the barber's chair, screaming as the iron key twisted inside their jaw. Today, the dentist's office is private, sterile, and, if we're honest, already terrifying enough. But in the Middle Ages, tooth extractions weren't just a medical necessity. They were a performance, a grotesque spectacle staged in bustling town squares, where the agony of one unlucky patient became entertainment for dozens of gawking neighbours. Let's set the scene. It's market day in a medieval town. Merchants shout about bread and cheese, blacksmiths hammer iron. The air stinks of livestock and smoke. In the middle of the square, a man sets up a small wooden stool and lays out his tools. The crowd knows what's coming. The tooth drawer is here. This man isn't a doctor. He's a showman, a barber, a travelling quack, sometimes even a juggler or performer, moonlighting as a healer. His reputation depends on spectacle, not success. The more dramatic the screams, the more people believed in his skill. Pain was proof the cure was working. The patient, often desperate and already half mad from days of agony, is shoved onto the stool. There's no privacy, no dignity. Neighbours press in close, eager for the show. Children push to the front, eyes wide with excitement. Housewives whisper bets about whether the tooth will come out whole or shatter. This isn't medicine, it's theatre. The barber rolls up his sleeves, grabs his iron tongs, and begins. The first wrench sends the patient shrieking. Blood dribbles down the chin, splattering onto the ground. The crowd erupts in laughter, gasps, even applause. Some jeer, others cheer encouragement, like it's a wrestling match. To them, the screams are half the fun. And the tooth drawer plays to his audience. He waves the bloody tooth in the air, like a trophy when it finally rips free, holding it up so everyone can see the gore. Sometimes he strings extracted teeth together into a grisly necklace to advertise his services. Imagine that, a chain of rotting molars rattling around his neck, proof of past successes. But here's the truly shameful part. Patients often weren't treated for free. They paid for the privilege of being humiliated. Some gave coins up front, others agreed to let the tooth drawer keep the extracted tooth as payment. In some towns, poor villagers allowed their pain to be turned into a spectacle, just so they could afford to live another week, and if the tooth didn't come out cleanly, the crowd only enjoyed it more. Broken shards, cracked jaws, blood spurting. The messier it got, the bigger the entertainment value. What should have been tragedy became carnival. It wasn't just tooth pulling either. Quack dentists performed bizarre side acts to draw bigger crowds. Some swallowed live worms and pretended to cough them out of patients' mouths, proving they had cured the infamous toothworm. Others chanted prayers while smearing strange ointments across gums, turning the moment into a mix of miracle and mutilation. Theatrics mattered more than results, and sometimes patients didn't survive. Too much blood loss, infection setting in instantly, or shock from sheer pain. When this happened in public, the body was dragged away, and the tooth drawer shrugged, moving on to the next customer. The show had to go on. Death wasn't a scandal. It was just another part of the performance. Now imagine you're that patient. You're dragged onto a stool while dozens of eyes bore into you. The barber pries your mouth open with filthy fingers. You smell his sour breath as iron scrapes against your tooth. He twists, pain explodes, the crowd roars, your vision blurs, and before you can even process what's happening, your bloody tooth is dangling in the air, shown to strangers like a prize pig at the fair. The humiliation cuts almost as deep as the pain. For the travelling tooth drawers, this humiliation was a business model. The louder the screams, the bigger the crowds. The bigger the crowds, the more patients lined up. Pain was profit. And this wasn't rare. Throughout Europe, fairs and markets often featured tooth pullers alongside jugglers, bear baiting and puppet shows. Dentistry was a carnival act. Medical necessity turned into grotesque comedy, with human suffering as the punchline. By the late Middle Ages, some towns began licensing tooth drawers, trying to control the chaos, but the culture of spectacle remained. In fact, some quacks leaned into it harder, dressing in colourful costumes, cracking jokes as they worked, turning mutilation into vaudeville. The worse the agony, the better the reputation. And the people loved it. Not because it worked, half the time it didn't, but because it was communal. Pain wasn't suffered alone in silence. It was shared, laughed at, applauded. Medieval dentistry turned misery into entertainment and humiliation into ritual. So next time you sit nervously in a clean dental office, staring at sterile tools, imagine this: a muddy town square, a crowd of strangers, a drunk barber with iron tongs, and your pain served up as a sideshow. If you thought having your own rotten tooth ripped out in front of a laughing crowd was bad, wait until you hear what medieval dentists did when it came to replacing them. Because yes, people in the Middle Ages actually attempted tooth transplants. And the story of where those teeth came from and how they were shoved into bleeding mouths is the stuff of nightmares. The idea wasn't new. Ancient medical texts hinted at replacing lost teeth with those from animals or corpses. By the medieval period, this became a crude but thriving practice. Wealthy patients, desperate to restore their smiles, paid to have fresh human teeth inserted into their jaws. Where did these teeth come from? From the mouths of the poor, from criminals, and sometimes from the dead. Picture a street scene. A rich merchant, missing his front teeth, wants to look respectable again. He visits a barber surgeon, who announces he'll provide donor teeth. A beggar is dragged in, hungry and desperate. For a handful of coins, or sometimes nothing but force, his healthy teeth are ripped out with iron tongs. Blood sprays, the beggar screams, and his misery becomes the merchant's new grin. And it didn't stop there. Execution grounds became a gruesome supply shop. After hangings, tooth drawers swarmed over corpses, yanking out teeth while the bodies still dangled from the rope. Soldiers killed in battle were stripped not just of armour but of molars and incisors. The dead became a harvest for the living, and these stolen teeth were shoved straight into the mouths of paying clients, with no cleaning, no fitting, nothing. The process itself was grotesque. The surgeon would hammer the donor tooth into the raw socket of the patient, hoping it would take root. Sometimes he smeared the base with honey, resin, or even dung to seal it in place. Infection was almost inevitable. Pus oozed. The gums swelled. The tooth often fell out within days, leaving the patient poorer, sicker, and still toothless. But if the transplant worked, or at least didn't fall out immediately, it was considered a miracle. Wealthy women flaunted their new smiles, never admitting that the gleaming tooth in their mouth had once belonged to a beggar, a criminal, or a corpse dragged from a grave. And of course the black market exploded. Thieves began hunting for fresh teeth to sell. Some assaulted travellers not for their purses but for their mouths, pinning them down and ripping out molars to hawk to barbers. Grave robbers desecrated tombs, pulling teeth from skeletons and selling them as if they were fresh. One medieval chronicler even complained about merchants of teeth travelling with bags of bloody molars like butchers with meat. Imagine being the poor donor. You live in filth, starving. A barber offers a single coin if you'll let him rip out a front tooth. You agree, thinking it will feed you for a day. The iron tongs crush your gums, the pain blinding. You leave with blood pouring from your face, humiliated, weakened. Meanwhile, that tooth, your tooth, is shoved into the mouth of a noblewoman, so she can smile at banquets. Your suffering becomes her vanity. And worse, transplanted teeth often carried disease. Think of it. One person's rotten mouth directly implanted into another's open wound. Syphilis, plague, even leprosy could spread this way. Many patients died not from their missing teeth, but from the cure. But in a world without germ theory, nobody made the connection. There's also a shameful class divide here. The poor lost teeth, the rich bought them. Nobles strutted with mouths full of borrowed grins, while peasants hid in the shadows, their faces wrecked by extraction. In a sense, the teeth of the powerless literally became part of the powerful. It was exploitation at its most intimate and grotesque. Sometimes animals were dragged into this horror too. Desperate surgeons tried implanting animal teeth, dogs, pigs, sheep, into human jaws. These teeth, too large and misshapen, cracked instantly or rotted in place, turning gums septic. Patients gagged on the stench, the pain unbearable. Some believed they had absorbed the spirit of the animal. Imagine a nobleman boasting of his new molar, only to reek of pig rot every time he opened his mouth. By the late Middle Ages, some surgeons started sewing teeth in place with silk thread. They drilled tiny holes into neighbouring teeth and tied the implant in, hoping it would stay put. This often damaged the surrounding teeth, spreading decay faster. Within months, the entire jaw could collapse. The solution to vanity left many worse than before, disfigured, dying, or rotting alive. Now picture it, A dim back room, reeking of blood and sweat. A wealthy man reclines on a stool, lips trembling. The barber approaches with a bloody tooth, just pulled from a corpse at the gallows. He jams it into the raw socket. The merchant winces as pain shoots through his skull. The crowd outside still cheers. Another miracle, another cure. Days later, the wound festers, the jaw swells, and the merchant's breath stinks of rot. His new smile kills him slowly. This was the cruel reality of medieval dentistry's attempt at sophistication. Tooth transplants weren't science. They were grotesque experiments fueled by desperation, exploitation, and greed. Before anesthesia, before sterilization, before even the faintest concept of dentistry as a science, medieval healers still tried something ambitious, saving rotten teeth. Extraction was brutal, dangerous, and often deadly, so some dentists thought they could patch up cavities instead. The result? A parade of fillings and plugs made from the strangest, dirtiest, and deadliest materials imaginable. The logic was simple. If there's a hole, plug it. But what they used makes modern stomachs turn. The most common substance was beeswax. Soft, pliable, and easy to stuff into a cavity, it seemed like a natural choice. But it melted in heat, broke down in days, and trapped food and bacteria inside the hole. Instead of healing, it created festering pockets of pus. Some patients gagged on the rancid smell as wax mixed with rot. Then came resins and tar. Medieval surgeons dripped pine resin or even pitch into cavities, hoping the sticky goo would harden into a protective shell. Instead, it poisoned mouths. Tar burned tender gums, leaving blisters. Resin cracked into shards, stabbing nerves. People described chewing as biting glass. Yet desperate patients begged for it, anything to dull the throbbing fire in their skulls. Metal was another favourite. Tiny plugs of lead or tin were hammered into cavities with mallets. Imagine the scene. Your tooth already hollowed by decay. Your barber jamming a lump of metal inside, pounding it flat until it wedged in. The vibration alone was torture. Nerves screaming with every strike, and lead, toxic, heavy, slowly poisoning the bloodstream. Patients suffered headaches, delirium, even seizures, never linking their madness to the cure rotting in their jaw. In some places, healers used bone dust or ground seashells, packed in with saliva to harden. But these crumbled instantly, under chewing, becoming grit that scraped gums raw. Worse, bone dust often came from human remains, ground down by grave robbers. So yes, medieval mouths sometimes carried the teeth of the dead as fillings, rotting them from the inside out. Another bizarre practice was using cloth plugs. Surgeons stuffed bits of linen or wool soaked in herbs into cavities. At first, the cloth softened pain by cushioning the exposed nerve. But within hours, the cloth filled with saliva, food and blood, turning into a nest for bacteria. Maggots were even reported squirming from the decayed cloth plugs in rare, horrifying cases. And when these fillings failed, out came the fire. Some barbers burned resin into cavities with red-hot irons, cauterizing the hole shut. Imagine the hiss, the smell of cooking enamel, the scream of a patient pinned to a stool as their tooth literally smoked. The tooth might stop hurting because the nerve was scorched dead. But often the heat fractured the tooth entirely, shattering it into splinters buried deep in the gum. Let's not forget the herbal pastes, garlic, onion, mustard seed, even crushed leeches were mashed into mixtures and stuffed into cavities. The belief? Strong flavours would drive out the toothworm. The reality? Chemical burns, foul breath, and gum so raw that patients couldn't eat for days. Some dentists He even used arsenic powder in tiny amounts to numb pain. It worked briefly, before burning tissue to black sludge. The filthiest fillings came from folk healers who swore by animal dung. Yes, horse or cow dung, dried and ground, packed into cavities to draw out infection. Villagers actually lined up for this, spitting blood and manure as the mixture festered in their teeth. It didn't heal, it poisoned. And yet people trusted it because superstition carried more weight than science. Imagine yourself in that world. Your molar throbs day and night. You beg the village barber not to yank it. You've seen too many die from bleeding. Instead, he melts resin over a candle, pours it into your mouth, and stuffs the cavity. At first, relief, then burning. Hours later, swelling balloons your face. The resin cracks, shards slice your gums, pus oozes thick down your throat. You choke on the taste of rot and tar, and yet you're told it's working. The humiliation didn't end with the pain. Wealthy clients sometimes demanded their fillings be visible, proof they could afford advanced treatment. A mouth glittering with tin or lead plugs was a grotesque status symbol, even as it poisoned them from within. Picture a noble woman smiling at a banquet, her mouth gleaming with toxic metal, her breath reeking of decay, her beauty paid for in agony. And of course no one cleaned instruments. Wax spatulas, resin spoons, hammers, all smeared with blood and pus from patient after patient. Every filling carried the risk of infection. Every plug a gamble between temporary relief and slow death. The saddest part. These fillings often prolonged the suffering instead of ending it. Instead of pulling the rotten tooth, people carried it longer, festering, stinking, poisoning their entire body. Some lingered for years, jaws swollen, fevers constant, until finally death came as mercy. This was medieval dentistry's idea of progress. Not cure, not comfort, but stuffing rot with filth, plugging agony with poison, and selling suffering as sophistication. If medieval dentistry stopped at ripping teeth out or stuffing them with wax, that would already be horrific. But some dentists went further, trying to reshape teeth, to file, chisel, or even break them into submission. What passed for cosmetic or medical care in the Middle Ages often left mouths wrecked forever. Filing was the most common. The idea was simple. If a tooth was jagged or cracked, smooth it down. The tool, a coarse metal rasp, often the same file used to sharpen knives. The patient sat on a stool while the barber ground the file against their tooth, sparks sometimes flying from the friction. The screech of metal on enamel echoed through the square. The pain, excruciating, filing exposed nerves, making even a sip of water feel like fire. And because no one cleaned the files, infection raced into the open pulp. Some filings weren't about health at all. Certain medieval cultures believed filed or pointed teeth were signs of status or beauty. Soldiers sometimes sharpened their incisors to look fierce, like predators. Imagine a warrior smiling, his teeth whittled into crude fangs. What he also smiled with was agony, exposed roots, infections, gums rotting around the mutilation. Then there was chiseling. If a tooth was crooked or overlapping, some barbers tried to fix it with a hammer and chisel. Picture a small iron wedge, jammed between teeth, then a swift blow. The goal: knock the offending tooth into place, or break off the part that stuck out. The reality: shattered enamel, bleeding gums, and sometimes entire teeth breaking free. The sound, a crack like splitting wood, haunted marketplaces long after. Patients often staggered away, holding bloody fragments in their hands. And it didn't stop there. For severe misalignment, some medieval surgeons tried something even worse, deliberately breaking jaws. chroniclers describe procedures where the lower jaw was cracked to reset the bite. No splints, no anaesthetic, no sterile bandages, just a hammer, brute force, and a belief that the bones would heal straighter. More often, the jaw set crooked, leaving patients permanently disfigured. Cosmetic experiments were equally gruesome. Wealthy patrons sometimes demanded their teeth be polished white for feasts. The barber obliged by scraping away enamel with pumice stones or metal knives. At first the smile gleamed. Weeks later, the teeth crumbled, brittle without enamel protection. Noble banquets echoed with coughing and spitting as aristocrats lost their teeth in chunks mid-meal. Some quacks even tried whitening teeth with corrosive powders, mixtures of vinegar, salt and crushed bone. Applied with rags, they bleached teeth temporarily, but ate straight through enamel. Mouths reeked of acid, gums blistered, and within months, the cure destroyed entire sets of teeth. Now imagine yourself in that chair. Your tooth sticks out awkwardly, causing gossip. The barber says he can fix it. He wedges a chisel against your molar. The first strike makes your skull ring. Pain floods every nerve. The second strike cracks the tooth in half. Blood sprays across your chin. The crowd gasps, then laughs. You spit fragments into the dirt. The barber shrugs. Better than before, but the jagged stump left behind festered, throbbing with each heartbeat. You went in crooked. You left mutilated. Even children weren't spared. Parents sometimes forced filings on their kids to fix crooked teeth, believing it would help them marry better. Imagine a 10-year-old sobbing as a rasp screeches across tender enamel, gums splitting under pressure. The pain marked them for life, not with straight teeth, but with trauma and scars. And yet, people accepted it, because in a world where appearance and superstition mattered as much as survival, mutilation was better than ridicule. Sharpened teeth meant bravery. White teeth meant wealth. A chiseled jaw meant beauty, even if it killed you slowly. The irony? Many of these procedures left patients needing more extractions later, driving them back into the torture chair. A cycle of agony, humiliation, and death sold as progress. As brutal as medieval barbers and tooth draws were, not everyone could afford them, and many people, terrified of the public humiliation of having their agony turned into a sideshow, decided to take matters into their own hands. What followed was a whole underground world of DIY dentistry, peasants ripping out their own teeth with knives, stones, and bare fingers. Imagine the scene. You're a farmer living in a smoky hut. Your molar has been throbbing for weeks, swollen until half your face is grotesquely puffed. You can't chew. You can't sleep. Every heartbeat feels like fire in your jaw. You don't have money for the barber. And even if you did, you've seen neighbours come back from his chair with shattered jaws or infections that killed them days later. So you pick up the sharpest knife in your home, grip it with trembling hands, and decide to solve the problem yourself. Knives were the most common tool. People jammed the blade under the rotten tooth and tried to lever it out. Sometimes it worked, but more often the knife slipped, slicing the gums to ribbons or stabbing straight through the cheek. Medieval chronicles tell of peasants nearly bleeding to death in their huts, their mouths shredded from failed attempts, and those who succeeded often left shards of tooth embedded in the gum, festering until the infection spread. For those too afraid of knives, there was the stone method. A desperate villager would place a small rock or piece of metal against the bad tooth, then strike it with another stone like a hammer and nail. One blow, if lucky, could knock the tooth out, but more often It shattered the tooth into fragments, drove splinters deep into the jaw, and cracked surrounding teeth. The sound echoed through huts like bones breaking. Sometimes the blow broke the jaw entirely. Imagine drinking broth through clenched, crooked teeth for the rest of your short life. Some even tried to pull teeth with bare hands. Families would gather around, 2 or 3 relatives holding the victim down, while another gripped the tooth with cloth or rags for traction. The victim screamed, thrashed, bled. Sometimes the tooth came free, dangling with a chunk of gum attached. Sometimes nothing happened, except the victim passed out, face covered in blood, while the tooth stubbornly remained. And then there were ropes. People tied string around the bad tooth, attached the other end to a door or beam, and yanked. The tooth sometimes came free with a gush of blood and a scream that echoed down the street. But more often, the rope slipped, slicing gums and lips, tearing flesh instead of pulling enamel. Children's teeth were often yanked this way too, not gently, not playfully, but violently. Imagine a 6-year-old sobbing as their father slams a door, ripping the tooth and half the gum out in one go. Desperation drove even worse methods. Some heated metal rods and pressed them against rotten teeth to burn them loose. The result? Enamel cracked, gums charred, mouths stinking of cooked flesh. Others poured boiling water, vinegar, or even urine directly onto the tooth, hoping to dissolve the pain. The only thing dissolved was dignity. And when nothing worked, some turned to brute force. Chronicles describe men slamming their jaws against tables, walls, or even anvils to knock teeth free. Some succeeded, staggering away toothless but alive. Others broke their skulls instead. The humiliation of DIY dentistry was as sharp as the pain. Families whispered about the screams echoing through huts at night. Neighbours mocked those who tried and failed. A man missing half his teeth was a walking reminder of poverty, desperation, and shame. And yet, people kept doing it, because the agony of toothache was relentless, a torture that eroded sanity. Men prayed for death just to escape the throbbing. Women stuffed herbs into their mouths until they rotted. Children cried until their voices broke. When faced with endless suffering, even smashing your own teeth with stones seemed logical. Now, picture yourself again. The hut is dark. Your jaw pulses, swollen like a tumour. You grip a small knife. Your family holds your shoulders. You wedge the blade under your molar. The first push makes blood gush. You scream. The second push slips, slicing your gum wide open. Your mother sobs. Your father grips tighter. You push again, and this time, with a crack like splitting wood, the tooth comes free. You spit it into the dirt, blood flooding your tongue. Relief floods in, but only for a moment. Days later, fever grips you. The wound festers. The infection spreads. You die in silence. Your victory turned to defeat. This was the hidden world of medieval self-dentistry. Desperation, filth, and humiliation. Pain so unbearable, it drove people to butcher themselves, turning their huts into torture chambers. When knives, stones, and barber surgeons failed, there was still one place medieval people turned for relief: the church. Because in a world where medicine was crude and superstition ruled, priests often doubled as healers, and toothache, that relentless tormentor of peasants and kings alike, was often treated not with tools, but with prayers, relics, and exorcisms. The logic was simple. Pain came from demons, curses, or punishment from God. If your jaw throbbed, it wasn't an abscess or cavity. It was a spirit gnawing at your bones. And who better to battle spirits than the church? One of the most common cures was invoking Saint Apollonia. She was a Christian martyr tortured by having her teeth ripped out with iron tongs, and so she became the patron saint of toothache sufferers. Villagers prayed to her, lit candles before her image, and wore tiny tooth-shaped charms blessed in her name. Some even carried pulled human teeth as relics, believing they absorbed pain. Imagine dangling a stranger's molar around your neck, convinced it would calm the fire in your gums. Priests also performed blessings directly on mouths. A sufferer would kneel before the altar, while the priest pressed a cross against their cheek and recited Latin chants. Sometimes he sprinkled holy water into the open mouth, the bitter taste mixing with pus and blood. The hope was that the demon inside the tooth would flee. The reality, nothing changed, except maybe humiliation, as neighbours whispered about your cursed jaw. But sometimes the rituals went further, into full exorcisms. Toothache was seen as a minor possession, and priests shouted commands at the spirit inside the tooth. Imagine kneeling in a cold church while a priest bellows at your face, "Depart, foul worm of pain, leave this vessel of God." He strikes your jaw with a crucifix for emphasis. The congregation watches, half praying, half sniggering. You sit there, mouth swollen, aching, and now bruised from holy blows. Other remedies blended faith with filth. Priests advised sufferers to press relics, sometimes bits of bone, cloth, or even blood-soaked nails from martyrs, against the gum. The idea was that holy matter would drive out unholy pain, but relics weren't sterile. Imagine pressing a centuries-old bone fragment, touched by thousands of mouths, into your abscess. Infection guaranteed, but faith blinded people to the risk. Some rituals grew downright grotesque. In one practice, sufferers wrote their names on a strip of parchment, along with a prayer, and tied it around their jaws. For days they walked around with sweaty, filthy parchment strapped to their faces, drool soaking the holy words. Others stuffed psalm scrolls into their mouths overnight, convinced scripture itself could choke the demon worm inside. By morning the scrolls stank of saliva, blood, and decay. And then there were processions. In some villages, toothache sufferers were paraded to shrines, made to kneel with their mouths open, while the priest waved incense over their heads. The smoke filled their lungs, made them cough, made their eyes water. The priest declared the pain cleansed. The villagers clapped. The sufferer staggered home, still writhing in agony. Some priests even recommended bizarre penances. If your tooth ached, you must have sinned. Confess, fast, whip your back, or crawl to a shrine on your knees. Maybe then God would forgive you and end the torment. Imagine starving yourself for days, gums throbbing, praying for mercy that never came. Toothache became not just pain, but punishment, a constant reminder of your unworthiness. The most humiliating cures involved animal parts. Priests sometimes blessed mixtures of dog teeth, pig bones, or even crushed mouse skulls, then told sufferers to wear them in little pouches. People walked through villages with rotting animal parts dangling from their necks, convinced holiness sanctified the stench. Worse, some were told to rub these powders directly on their gums. Picture grinding mousebone into an open abscess, blood mixing with grit, stench choking your breath, and still believing salvation was on the way. And yet, people clung to these rituals, because sometimes faith did provide relief. The act of praying, the hope of divine mercy, the community gathering around, it gave people strength to endure what medicine couldn't fix. Placebo, yes, but powerful, enough to get through another night of pain, another day of misery. But when prayers failed, despair set in. Chroniclers tell of sufferers begging priests to curse their own teeth, asking God to strike them numb forever. Some begged to be excommunicated just to cast the pain away. Others smashed their jaws against altars in frustration, staining churches with blood. Now picture yourself again. It's midnight. Your tooth burns like fire. You stumble to the church, kneel before St. Apollonia's shrine, and press your swollen jaw against the cold stone. You whisper prayers, tears streaming. Behind you, the priest arrives, mutters Latin, sprinkles holy water. The droplets sting your open sore. You gag on incense. The priest declares you healed. You stagger home, still in agony, mouth swollen, faith shaken. This was the medieval church's cure for toothache. Faith, relics, humiliation, and rituals that did nothing but deepen suffering. In a world without real medicine, people clung to the sacred, even if it meant grinding mouse bones into their gums. When we think of monasteries, we picture quiet libraries, chants echoing in stone halls, and monks copying holy texts by candlelight. But monasteries were also some of the few places in medieval Europe where any kind of medical care existed. And yes, that included dentistry, except their cures for toothache were less about science and more about bleeding, booze, and bizarre improvisations. Monks weren't doctors, they were literate men with access to ancient texts, some Greek, some Arabic, some garbled through generations of mistranslation. In those books they read about humours, balance, and purging illness through bloodletting. And so, if your jaw throbbed and you begged a monastery for help, the first thing they did was bring out the lancet. Bloodletting was their go-to cure. The idea was that tooth pain came from excess blood pooling in the head. So monks sliced open veins in your arm, or sometimes directly in your gums, to release pressure. Imagine it. You're already weak, unable to eat from the agony, and now a tonsured monk with shaky hands carves open your flesh. Blood pours into a bowl. They nod, convinced balance has been restored. You stagger out paler, weaker, still in agony, but now dizzy from blood loss. And when cutting wasn't enough, out came the leeches. Slimy, writhing, clamped onto swollen cheeks, or even the inside of the mouth. Monks believed leeches could draw out bad humours, causing the pain. In reality, the leeches bled you, left bite wounds, and sometimes crawled down throats. There are records of patients choking as leeches slipped loose mid-treatment, but still monasteries swore by them. Beer was another cure. Monasteries brewed gallons of ale, and they weren't shy about prescribing it as medicine. Got a toothache? Drink until you forget it. Some monks insisted beer rinses cleansed gums. In practice, it just numbed the brain for an hour before the pain came roaring back. For severe swelling, monks poured hot ale straight onto the gums. Imagine searing alcohol soaking into an open abscess, burning like fire. They called it healing. Patients called it hell. Monasteries also produced herbal remedies. Cloves, garlic, mint and onion were mashed into pastes, smeared directly on teeth. Some worked a little, cloves especially, but others caused blistering, burns or choking. One recipe involved boiling frog fat and goat's milk into a paste to rub on the gums. Another used a concoction of vinegar and ground oyster shells. The grit shredded open wounds. The vinegar stung like acid. Relief was fleeting, infection almost guaranteed. And then there were the prayers mixed with remedies. A monk might smear your gums with honey and chant psalms, claiming God would guide the cure. Honey did help fight bacteria, but not when mixed with filthy fingers, cloth or knives straight from another patient's mouth. Infection spread anyway. Faith masked filth. Monks also experimented with cauterization. A red-hot poker pressed against the gum was said to burn out the devil of pain. Imagine lying in a monastery infirmary, incense smoke swirling, while two monks hold you down and another presses glowing iron against your jaw. The sizzle, The stench of charred flesh, the screams bouncing off stone walls. Some fainted instantly, others convulsed, some died. For those who survived, the tooth often cracked into pieces, leaving them worse off than before. And sometimes, monks simply gave up on medicine altogether and turned to ritual humiliation. Patients were told their toothache was punishment for gluttony, gossip, or lust. The cure, confession, fasting, and prayer. People were forced to kneel for hours with mouths open, enduring cold draughts on their swollen gums, told the pain would leave if they endured humiliation. It didn't. They left in agony, shamed into silence, but perhaps the strangest monastic practice was cheese poultices. Yes, monks smeared mouldy cheese directly onto gums. They believed the cheese's mould would eat the rot. In reality, it just made breath unbearable and spread more bacteria. Villagers nicknamed one monastery the Stinking Brothers because patients staggered home with mouths reeking of spoiled dairy and pus. Now imagine yourself again. You're desperate, dragging your swollen face to the monastery gate. The monks admit you, chanting softly. They sit you on a bench, tilt your head back, and tie a leech inside your cheek. You gag as it wriggles. Blood dribbles down your throat. They nod, satisfied. Then they hand you a mug of ale, order you to drink, and smear your gums with hot vinegar and ground shells. The pain spikes. You scream. They tell you to pray harder. Hours later, you stagger out, mouth raw, stomach spinning, body weaker, still in agony. This was monastic dentistry, bloodletting, leeches, beer, and bizarre concoctions that offered nothing but humiliation and infection. Yet people lined up, because compared to the marketplace tooth drawers, at least the monks wrapped their torture in the comfort of prayer. As if medieval dentistry wasn't already brutal enough, authorities soon realised that teeth, so small, so vulnerable, so tied to pain, made perfect targets for punishment. In an age where public humiliation was as important as physical suffering, breaking or ripping teeth became a favoured method of control, torture, and symbolic justice. The logic was cruel but simple. A missing tooth was permanent. It marked you forever. Unlike a whipping scar hidden beneath clothes, a shattered smile showed the world your disgrace every time you opened your mouth. It was a sentence you carried for life, a badge of shame carved into your own flesh. For thieves and beggars, one punishment was to have front teeth yanked out in public. The culprit was dragged into a marketplace, tied down, and handed over to the same tooth drawers who usually entertained crowds. Except this time, the screams weren't just treatment, they were punishment. Iron tongs clamped onto incisors, jerking them out one by one, blood spraying across the crowd. The message was clear: steal bread, lose your bite. From then on, eating became agony. Speaking became slurred. Every conversation marked you as a criminal. Some towns codified this into law. Court records from parts of Germany and Italy mentioned tooth breaking as a penalty. Judges ordered molars smashed with hammers, a spectacle staged in public squares. The crack of enamel echoed like gunfire. Victims reeled in pain, choking on blood and shards. The humiliation was worse than the agony. Whole villages watched as your face collapsed into ruin. Teeth were also used in interrogation. Torturers knew a single tooth could hold more pain than a lash to the back. Prisoners were bound, and crude pliers forced into their mouths. Each twist sent lightning through nerves, white-hot agony that made even the strongest warriors beg for mercy. Sometimes the tormentor didn't even finish the extraction, just twisted enough to loosen the tooth, leaving it dangling, sensitive, every breath a new wave of torture. Another method was tooth chiselling, a wedge of iron placed against a molar, struck with a mallet. not to remove it cleanly, but to split it into fragments. The pieces remained embedded, festering. Prisoners screamed as splinters tore their gums for weeks afterward. It wasn't just pain, and it was prolonged suffering, slow torture that outlasted the dungeon walls. And then there was the horror of tooth burning. Torturers heated iron needles or rods until they glowed, then pressed them against gums and teeth. The enamel cracked, nerves fried, flesh sizzled. The stench of charred bone filled chambers. Victims fainted, only to be revived for more rounds. For inquisitors, it was efficient, pain without killing. For victims, it was hell. A mouth turned into a furnace. Teeth were also symbolic. In some places, women accused of adultery or gossiping were punished by having their teeth blackened or broken. Beauty was tied to a smile, ruin it, and the woman was shamed forever. Imagine standing in a square while your neighbours watched a magistrate's men hammer your front teeth into powder, your bloodied grin marking you as fallen. War captives weren't spared either. Chronicles from Eastern Europe describe victors ripping out teeth from prisoners of war as trophies, stringing them on cords like grisly necklaces. Imagine being dragged through a camp, jaw swollen, while your captor flaunts your own molars as proof of domination. And humiliation reached even deeper. Some rulers ordered criminals' teeth nailed to city gates. The message was grotesquely clear: disobey, and your own body will decorate the town like carrion. Villagers walking by saw rotting teeth pinned like insects, each one a warning carved from human misery. Now put yourself there. You're accused of theft. The judge sentences you to lose 2 teeth as punishment. You're hauled to the square, tied to a post. The barber arrives, not with care, but with cruel glee. He jams his iron key into your mouth. The crowd jeers. Children laugh. The first twist snaps the tooth free with a gush of blood. You scream. The second resists, cracking instead of coming out clean. Splinters tear your gum as he yanks harder. Blood pours, your jaw throbs, your dignity collapses. You stagger away, spitting fragments into the mud, forever marked as a thief every time you open your mouth. This was medieval justice, teeth turned into weapons of shame. Pain wasn't just a side effect, it was the point. To make sure your suffering was visible, permanent, and unforgettable. And perhaps the darkest irony. The same tooth drawers who humiliated criminals for law and order were the ones people trusted to relieve their own pain. Dentistry and torture blurred into one, their tools identical, their screams indistinguishable. If you think suffering from toothache in the Middle Ages was a private hell, think again. Pain wasn't just endured, it was mocked. In a society that loved public humiliation, toothache became a punchline. People sang about it, laughed at it, and turned their neighbours' misery into crude jokes and tavern songs. The reason everyone knew the agony. Nearly every person, rich or poor, eventually suffered from rotten teeth. So instead of pity, toothache became a shared source of grim comedy. When your neighbour screamed at night from an abscess, people chuckled. The worm dances in his head. Pain was universal, so mocking it was safer than fearing it. Medieval satirists loved the toothache. Manuscripts survive with verses joking that tooth pain was proof of gluttony, a punishment from God for eating too much meat or sweets. Poets described sufferers as half mad, thrashing like animals, faces swollen into grotesque masks. Instead of compassion, the humour emphasised humiliation. One popular motif was the toothworm's song. Tavern singers performed bawdy tunes about invisible worms, chewing through a man's jaw, drinking his wine, and laughing at his cries. Patrons roared with laughter, mugs slamming on tables, even as half the room probably nursed their own aching molars. The more vulgar the imagery, worms wriggling, pus spilling, the louder the laughter. And then there were the jokes. Medieval jest books include cruel quips like, "Better to kiss a pig's arse than a toothless wife," or "A toothache cures lust quicker than a monk's sermon." The message was clear. Pain wasn't just torment, it was emasculating, demeaning, stripping sufferers of dignity. A man with swollen jaws couldn't eat, couldn't kiss, couldn't speak clearly. His misery was comic fodder. Even priests sometimes leaned into the humour. Sermons mocked sinners with lines like, "The toothache teaches humility, for who can boast with cheeks like a pig's bladder?" Imagine sitting in church, jaw throbbing, while your priest cracks jokes about your suffering to chuckles from the congregation. Your agony became the week's entertainment. And it wasn't just words. Tavern games mocked toothache too. Some involved men daring each other to bite into hard nuts or bones, laughing when someone cracked a rotten molar. Others mimicked the shrieks of extraction, howling exaggerated cries to win drinking bets. Whole evenings were spent laughing at the sounds of pain, a grotesque chorus of mock dentistry. Art joined in as well. Marginalia in manuscripts, those little doodles monks scribbled in the margins, often depicted figures clutching swollen cheeks, mouths gaping in screams, chased by worms or beaten by devils. The drawings were crude but cruel, reducing real suffering into slapstick cartoons. Imagine opening a Bible and finding, next to a psalm, a sketch of a man screaming with a worm crawling out of his jaw. And then there were the plays. Medieval morality plays occasionally included characters with toothache, groaning in exaggerated agony, while other characters mocked them. Crowds laughed at the sight of an actor writhing, holding his face, begging for mercy. It was theatre built on recognition. Everyone had felt that pain, so everyone could laugh at someone else enduring it. But perhaps the darkest humour was children mocking parents. Kids sang rhymes about mothers who couldn't scold because their teeth hurt, or fathers who slurred their words through swollen jaws. Families laughed at their own misery, because in a world where suffering was constant, humour was the only relief left. Now picture yourself again. You've just staggered out of a barber's chair, jaw bloody, tooth gone, face swollen like a melon. You limp into the tavern for ale to numb the pain. At the next table, a bard strums a lute and sings, "The worm drank his wine, now he drinks his blood." The crowd erupts in laughter, all eyes turning to your mangled smile. You sit in silence, cheeks burning hotter than your gums, your humiliation now a public joke. This was medieval humour, black, cruel, soaked in blood and ale. Pain wasn't respected. It was mocked, paraded, and turned into satire. The suffering of one became the laughter of many, and the irony? Those laughing often ended up in the same chair days later, screaming, bleeding, and becoming the next verse of the worm's song. If toothache tortured the living, it haunted the dead as well. In the Middle Ages, teeth weren't just painful, they were symbolic, markers of shame, tools of torture, and finally, grim relics of mortality. The story of medieval dentistry ends not in healing, but in graveyards, superstition, and the macabre trade in human remains. Teeth were among the few parts of the body that survived decay. Flesh rotted, bones crumbled, but teeth lingered, white jagged reminders of the person once alive. To medieval minds, this permanence was unsettling. Teeth became tokens of both protection and punishment, relics of suffering carried into the afterlife. In many villages, the tooth of a dead man was considered a charm. People pried teeth from corpses and wore them on strings around their necks to ward off toothache. Others buried their pulled teeth in fields, believing the pain would seep into the earth. Parents tucked children's baby teeth into walls, hoping to keep demons away. Imagine houses filled with hidden teeth, walls whispering with rot and superstition, funeral rituals sometimes fixated on mouths. Chroniclers describe bodies with mouths stuffed full of coins, herbs, or even stones to stop spirits from rising and biting the living. Rotting teeth became signs of sin. A corpse with blackened gums was said to have been a glutton, punished in death as in life. Priests preached that the agony of toothache was a preview of hellfire, gnawing eternally at sinners. Teeth also became trophies. Executioners pulled them from criminals to sell as charms. Soldiers collected enemy teeth on battlefields, stringing them like beads. One gruesome account describes a knight returning from war, with a belt studded with molars, grisly proof of his victories. In taverns, men bragged of the teeth they had ripped from foes as if humiliation didn't end with death. And there was the black market. Grave robbers dug up corpses to harvest teeth, selling them to tooth drawers who peddled them as donor teeth for transplants. Imagine paying dearly for a gleaming molar only to learn it once belonged to a plague victim rotting in the ground. These teeth, shoved into bleeding sockets, carried death directly into the living. Many who bought them never lived to show off their new smiles. Even art reflected the obsession. In danse macabre paintings, those eerie processions of skeletons leading the living to death, teeth grin grotesquely, mocking the viewers. Skeletons clutch their jaws, their smiles twisted, as if laughing at human agony. The message was cruelly clear. Your toothache, your rotting gums, your missing molars were just the beginning. In the end, death would strip you bare, leaving nothing but bones and a mouthful of teeth grinning forever. Now picture it. A peasant dies in his hut, face swollen from an abscess that finally poisoned his blood. His neighbours bury him shallow in the churchyard. Days later, a grave robber digs him up, pries his teeth free, stuffs them into a sack. Those teeth, still streaked with blood, are sold at the market. A noble woman buys one, hoping it will cure her pain. A barber jams it into a socket. Within days, she too is dead. The circle of misery continues, fed by superstition, greed, and the permanence of enamel. And so the tooth, tiny white, seemingly insignificant, became one of the cruelest symbols of the Middle Ages, a source of agony in life, a tool of torture and punishment, a joke in taverns, a relic in churches, a commodity in graveyards. Even in death it refused to disappear, lingering as a mocking reminder of human suffering. For medieval people, toothache was more than pain. It was humiliation, entertainment, punishment, superstition, and finally, decay. A reminder that in a world without science, every bite was a gamble, every smile a risk, and every scream an echo of mortality. So next time you sit in a dentist's office, sterile tools glinting under bright lights, remember, not so long ago, your treatment would have been a market spectacle, your pain a tavern song, and your teeth a relic in someone else's pocket. This was the truth of medieval dentistry. Not healing, but horror. Not relief, but rot. And behind every gap-toothed grin of history lies a story of blood, humiliation, and the simple, eternal fact that even the smallest bone in the body can define a lifetime of suffering.